evil plans. After Peter saved Tiger Lily, the Navajo people became great friends of his and would sit guarding his home from the parents every night. One evening, Wendy told the Lost Boys their favourite story about the darling children who flew away to Neverland, but had a mother who always kept a window open for them, and so, one day, they happily returned to her. "I used to think my mother would always keep a window open," Peter told them crossly, "so I stayed away for a long time. But when I flew back it was shut, and she had forgotten all about me." Peter couldn't really recall any such thing, but all this talk about leaving Neverland annoyed him. The darling children looked at each other in horror. What if their own mother shut the window? "Wendy, let's go home," cried John and Michael. "Yes," answered Wendy, "let's go at once." But the Lost Boys gazed at her forlornly. "Dear one," she said, "come with us. I am sure Mother and Father will adopt you." The Lost Boys jumped for joy, but Peter looked stern. "I am not going with you, Wendy," he said, and to show he did not care if they went, Peter played on his pipes. "Oh, Peter," said Wendy, "well, I'm going to give you your medicine before we go." Wendy loved to give medicine, but she stopped when she saw Peter's expression. The Lost Boys stared at Peter glumly. "Now then," cried Peter, "no fuss, no blubbering. Goodbye, Wendy, goodbye, boys." But just at that moment, the pirates began their attack. The children listened to the cries and the clash of steel above the ground, straining to make out who was winning. The pirates had taken the warriors by surprise. Tiger Lily and her strongest braves fought with courage, but eventually were all captured. Then Hook, possibly at his most dreadfully wicked, ordered Shmee to beat the Navajo tom-tom drum. Down below, Peter and the others heard it and thought that Tiger Lily and her braves had won. Goodbyes were said again, and all the children, except Peter, went to their trees. Up above, a pirate stood guard by each tree and caught each child as they came up. Then Slightly's turn came. Now, out of all the Lost Boys, Slightly most certainly enjoyed dinner time the most, and he had a big round belly to prove it. Hook looked intently at Slightly and suddenly had an interesting new idea. A tree hole that would fit a boy this size would certainly also fit one James Hook. Ordering that the prisoners be taken to the ship, Hook waited until Peter was asleep and then squeezed down the hole. At the bottom, Hook saw Peter's medicine bottle on a shelf, and an evil plan formed in his mind. Opening the bottle, he added a few drops of the most deadly poison, then carefully put it back on the shelf and left quietly before Peter woke up. A moment later there was a little knock at the door. "Let me in, Peter," cried Tink. Quickly she told him what had happened to Wendy and the boys. "I'll rescue them," cried Peter, "and I must take my medicine, as Wendy asked." As Peter raised the bottle, Tink smelled the poison. There was no time to explain. Flying in front of his lips, she drank the medicine, and instantly she fell to the floor. Tink's voice was so frail, Peter could hardly hear it. "Poisoned? Tink!" he cried. "Could you get well again if children believed in fairies?" And though no other children were there, Peter called to every child who might be dreaming of Neverland. "If you believe in fairies, clap your hands. Don't let Tink die." Many, many clapped, and Tinker Bell was saved. The pirate ship. As the moon rose, Peter set off for the Jolly Roger, and all the children chained so they could fly away, roared Hook. "Aye, aye, sir." "Then hoist them up," said Hook. "Tonight, Wendy, you will see your children walking the plank." Shmee bound Wendy to the mast, but as the boys lined up before the plank, Hook's evil smile froze. From below he heard a chilling tick, tick, tick. As the terrified pirates hid, The lost boys looked over the side. It was not the crocodile ticking, but Peter, still making the sound. He found the keys, freed the boys, and untied Wendy. Then he stood by the mast in her cloak. "Lads," blustered Hook, "the girl is bad luck. Throw her overboard." "There's no one can save you now," jeered Starkey. "I can think of someone," said the cloak boy. "Peter Pan, the Avenger." Peter flung off the cloak, and the lost boys jumped out and attacked. Taken by surprise, the pirates fought very poorly. Finally, only Hook was left. "Put up your swords, boys," cried Peter. "This man is mine." Never has such a fight been seen. Peter was getting the better of his deadly foe, so Hook leapt onto the bulwark, hoping to dive off and escape. Peter flew through the air and gave him a huge kick. On his way to the ship, Peter had seen Hook's crocodile, noticed its clock had run down, and devised his plan. Now the beast, having followed the familiar sound, was waiting silently below. It was into those giant jaws that Hook fell. Captain Pan. Early the next morning, Peter and the lost boys were all out and about. They put on the pirate's clothes, the trousers cut off at the knee, and naturally Peter's was ship's captain. Tootles was made boatswain, with Nibs and John as first and second mate. Peter's orders struck a very pirate-like note, and all hands cheered him heartily. "It's time to take Wendy home," Peter told his crew. "We sail for the Azores, and after that it will save time if we fly." Many boys were in favour of turning pirate, but Peter ordered that it should be an honest boat, though the general feeling was that it did so to lull Wendy's suspicions. No one would dare to question Captain Pan. But we must not stay with the Jolly Roger. We must leave the children to their voyage and return to the sad home which Wendy, John and Michael Darling left so long ago. Back at home, Mr. Darling was asleep in the doghouse, his punishment for locking Nana out on that fateful night, and Mrs. Darling had fallen asleep in her chair in the nursery. Now, we know that her children were rubbishy and had not thought of her often, but she couldn't help loving them still, and often sat near the open window, hoping they would come back. All of a sudden, Peter appeared outside the window. The thought of Wendy leaving was so sad that he had changed his mind. "Quick, Tink," he whispered, "close the window. Wendy will think that her mother has forgotten her, so she will come back with us." Together they pulled it shut, but when Peter peeped inside, he saw that there were 2 sad tears running down Mrs. Darling's cheeks. "She must be awfully fond of Wendy," thought Peter, "but I'm fond of Wendy too. We can't both have her." But Peter could not forget those 2 sad tears. "Oh, all right," he said at last, and gulped. Then he opened the window. "Come on, Tink," he cried, and flew away. So when Wendy, John and Michael returned, they found the window open after all. Very quietly they landed on the nursery floor and slipped into bed. And when Mrs. Darling woke up, she thought that she was still dreaming. "Mother!" cried Wendy. "Mother!" cried Michael and John. Mrs. Darling opened her arms and the children ran to her. "George!" she cried to her husband. Mr. Darling ran into the nursery, closely followed by Nana, and there can never have been such a blissful scene of welcome. Downstairs, the lost boys had been told to count to 500 before following. Now they stood in a row, looking up hopefully at Mr. and Mrs. Darling. Of course, Mrs. Darling wanted to adopt them straight away. It took Mr. Darling a little longer to get used to the idea of being a father to so many children. But when it was agreed at last, he went off dancing about the house with Happiness, and they all danced after him. Wendy did see Peter again. He came to say goodbye before he and Tink flew home. He asked Wendy to come with him. Mrs. Darling said no, but when she saw how sad Peter looked, she agreed that Wendy could visit for 1 week every year. So each spring, if Peter remembered, he would fly back and take Wendy away for more adventures in Neverland. I hope you enjoyed the story.